Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another great session with PassionateSoccerCoach.com. My name is Alden Bislagic. I'm your host. We have a special guest today, Mitch, Toda. We're going to be talking about warm-up, stretching, cool-downs, and the importance of it. But I don't want to talk about it too much. I'm going to let Mitch introduce himself, and then we'll get into it. Welcome, Mitch.
Thanks for having me, Alden. My name is Mitch Toda. Alden and I know each other from our collegiate soccer days with Quinnipiac. We were teammates for 3 seasons, I think. We crossed paths, and I'm currently an athletic trainer working with Orlando City Soccer Club in Major League Soccer. I currently work in an environment where I provide support for other athletic trainers working in our MLS academy system, so the MLS Next Academy system. So I work with youth athletes from age 9 all the way up to high school age. And as a matter of fact, some of those players get signed for our first and second teams. So I have plenty of involvement with youth soccer. And so when I was asked to be on this podcast with Alden, I jumped on the opportunity. So thanks for having me.
Excellent. Welcome, Mitch. Good to see you. Tell the audience, why is it so essential to have a warm-up and cool-down and stretching? Why is it essential?
I think it comes down to building good habits, right? And if you look at all the successful players that come up to the pro ranks, they've developed routines that are based off of promoting health and well-being, right? One of the essentials for being successful as an athlete is maintaining health and warming up, stretching, cooling down. It's part of health maintenance, right? You want to stay healthy so you can perform and do your best on the field. If you're injured, you're not going to be able to perform, and you're going to miss time from kicking the soccer ball. So I think in order to perform at your best, these are essentials for athletes of all ages.
What are some key components to a warm-up for youth players? What would you say?
So for me, an effective warm-up will consist of a combination of foundational fitness exercises like core stability, glute activation, balance exercises, but also including various functional movement patterns like squatting, lunging, and also dynamic and ballistic movements. So hopping, jumping, cutting, pivoting, all the movements that you would use on a soccer field. And really, honestly, it depends on the type of session that the coach is running, right? And so if the coach has a small space, lots of change of direction type of session, then you may want to focus a little bit more on, let's say, calves or adductors, because those are the muscles that you use for a lot of the acceleration, deceleration, change of direction. And then if you're opening up to a big space, maybe you want to focus on some hamstring, right, and hip flexors so that you can prepare for big runs and also big kicks. So it might depend a little bit on the session that you have planned as a coach, but an effective warm-up really encompasses all those things.
How do warm-up exercises contribute to injury prevention? I know you mentioned injuries. How do they help you reduce that risk factor?
Yeah, I think the main thing is it primes your muscles and your joints, your body, to prepare for the demands of the sport through warm-up exercises. So to kind of get into a little bit of physiology, right? You promote blood flow to the muscles through exercise, and blood flow brings nutrients, oxygen, things of that nature, and it heats up the muscles. The muscles become a little bit more extensible, the joints become a little bit more responsive to stimuli, and so it has a protective effect against any potential injury.
Fantastic. And any specific drills you would recommend to youth coaches that are pretty effective? I know at the young ages, we always encourage like warm up with the ball and then some dynamic stretches. Is there anything from your level, because you see it at academy, MLS Next, and then of course professionals as well? What would you recommend to the coaches?
So the first thing that comes to mind is, what we used to do, right? Like even back in our college days, Alden, we used to do the whole circle up and stretch type of routine. Well, that's pretty outdated I think you would agree with that as a longtime coach. And so that's certainly not what I would recommend. Some ways to really keep players engaged. I used to run some warm-ups for collegiate teams that I've worked with in the past. And so for those, I used to set up stations. And so I would have a station with cones focusing on change of direction. I would have a station with hurdles working on some jumping and change directions. Hula hoops, right? So they can hop on one to the other and balance. Agility ladders to work on some footwork, and some resistance band to work on some core and glute exercises. So it's a way to encompass all the components that you would want in a warm-up, but in stations. And that was actually something that I thought worked pretty effectively to keep the players on task, because they're very short tasks, right? And so you just go from one station to the next, and you just kind of cycle through, maybe 90 seconds to 2 minutes each. And so you get through a warm-up routine. If you have 4 or 5 stations, that's maybe 10 minutes and you're gone. So
fantastic. Brings us to the next point, which means like the importance of incorporating dynamic stretching, right, into the warm-ups. What's your take on the dynamic stretching?
So soccer as a sport is a dynamic sport, right? So the body should be prepared to move dynamically. So really, you want to promote through warm-up excitation of the muscles, right? Its ability to activate on cue and on demand. Whereas, with dynamic stretching, you can do that. But whereas with static stretching, you're promoting more relaxation of the muscles. So you can get into a little bit of physiology, but there's some science to that. And so working on a little bit more dynamic stretching strategies would help with some more activating of the muscles rather than promoting the relaxation of it. And so to prepare for the demands of the sport, it's almost mandatory to have a dynamic stretching component.
Can you give some examples that youth players can follow or coaches can, like, I know there's a lot of stuff they can, for example, go on YouTube and look it up, like dynamic stretching, like you can, I think nowadays there's so much information out there that everybody that wants to find it, you can find it. But dynamic stretching is, like, give us some examples. Like for you, like, does everybody from youth system to like professionals follow the same dynamic stretching, or they alter a little bit throughout the stages?
Yeah, I think for the most part, you have a general template or a model that you can follow, that covers all the muscles that you want to. But me in particular, one of my favorites is the lunge hip flexor stretch with an overhead reach. And so the reason why I say that is because hip flexors and quads are the most overactive muscles in soccer players, all ages. And I'd also say that they're the most neglected in terms of stretching, right? And so there's a major cascading effect that actually steps from hip flexor tightness or contractures. And so players with complaints like hamstring tightness and low back pain and knee pain and even shin and calf pain, sometimes, well, more often than not, can actually be traced back to poor biomechanics due to hip flexor tightness. And so that's one that I always incorporate in any kind of warm-up that I would have the players do.
Excellent. You talked about routine, right? Routine is warm-up, dynamic stretching, and then after like performance, there's a cool down, right? Far too often what I'm seeing, Mitch, out there is kids just walk off the field, or like just after a game, there's no proper cool down. Like tell me the importance of a cool down.
Well, I think it's really important. I think one of the things that, again, kind of getting into a little bit of science here, but the most important thing about a cool down is after a vigorous exercise routine, right? So if you have a really tough training session, or if you have a really tough game, you utilize energy, right? Energy in the form of ATP. And so with that, unless you're replenishing the oxygen, that is essentially, so let me back it up a little bit. after an intense bout of exercise, it creates an acidic environment in your body because you're using energy in the form of ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, and that uses oxygen. And so that then, as a byproduct, creates lactic acid. Okay, we've all heard about lactic acid. So everyone thinks lactic acid is bad. Well, it's kind of a natural thing that happens with an intense bout of exercise. So with a cool down, when you do a low intensity aerobic activity, getting oxygen back into your body is what happens. And by doing that, it actually adds oxygen back to the lactic acid, and it's actually converting it back to ATP, which is a source of energy. And so that is kind of the scientific background for why cool down is very important. It is often neglected, in my opinion, because it's not intentionally structured into a training session or post-game routine. So that's kind of where I think, coaches really should be more intentional sometimes with, all right, guys, we're taking, the last 10 minutes of the session here to do a proper cool down. Hopefully that answered your question there.
No, it did. That's fantastic. Like with the routines that you're going into, I think one major thing like we didn't talk about is hydration throughout these performances and warm-ups. I think you just brought it up, like the energy levels and how you're going to help your muscles recover even faster, right? It's not just to warm up, dynamic stretching and cool downs, and like bringing like replenishing yourself with the proper hydration and if it's an energy bar or something, like I think you just mentioned it as well. It's going to help you with the recovery stages. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. When it comes to recovery, I'm just going to touch on this. This might be a little bit off the path of where you were taking it, but in terms of recovery, I think it's really important to build these habits because there's a concept in the performance world called the other 22. And that concept is really, if you're training for 2 hours a day, what are you doing during the other 22 hours a day to prepare yourself to perform at your best during the next 2 hour training session, right? Maybe it's the next day. So having a proper cool down, right? A consistent cool down routine, that would be a healthy habit, a proper warm-up routine, et cetera, et cetera. But hydration falls under that, right? What are you doing outside of training so that you are prepared for your next session? Right? Because if you don't do the things that you need to do to prepare for the next session, then you're going to perform poorly. You might lose playing time because you're not training well, et cetera, et cetera. So building a routine and in those healthy habits is absolutely crucial, right? So the other 22, it's a concept that I talked about a lot with our youth athletes because oftentimes, yeah, they as soon as the training session is over, they're just walking off and going home, and they're not doing anything to prepare, right, to start the preparation process right away for that next session. So it's kind of a mental switch, I think, right? As soon as training's over, cool down, protein, carbohydrates, fluids. I mean, those are essential to start preparing for that next session. So that preparation starts right away.
Yeah, that's so crucial. And I wanted to touch up on this because I know it's going to help you not getting cramps. It's going to help you develop even further. And not only the importance of a proper warm-up, dynamic stretching, or cool down. That's what you do, like you said, outside on your own. Even stretching at home, in addition to like you're stretching on the fields, that's going to help you even be more flexible and help you, be a better athlete at the end of the day.
I'll add on that. I'll just piggyback on what you just said. So stretching at home, I think, is a crucial thing. So I always say that if you stretch throughout the day, it's a lot more effective than just stretching once before and after practice, right? So if you are doing shorter bouts of stretching throughout the day, let's say 5 or 6 times throughout the day, right? That can add up, right? That's 30 to 45 minutes of stretching that you can add to the day. And if you think about how our society is, we're always sitting, right? So if you're going from home to school, you're sitting in a car. At school, you're sitting at your desk. You go from school to training right away, let's say, you're sitting in a car to travel. and then you go home and you sit down and eat dinner. Like you're always sitting. And so if you're not stretching throughout the day to counteract the effects of sitting, you're really not doing too much. And so if you can stretch throughout the day to essentially, even if it's just 5-10 minutes at a time to do that, that is a lot more effective for, again, athletes of all ages than just stretching once or twice before and after training.
100%. So coming back to the proper warm-up, dynamic stretching and cool down, in your opinion, like the coach, what role does he play, or he or she play in that kind of implementation of that consistent routine?
I think in youth programs, the technical staff, the coaches, they set the culture, right? And so there needs to be, in my opinion, a short list of non-negotiables, that is set by the coach. And so if the coach allows for a player to arrive late and just jump right into an intense training session without an adequate warm-up, that's a standard that is set by the coach. But on the contrary, if a coach stands firm on scheduling time before and after session, for an adequate warm-up and cool down, or if a player does, come late because of schedule conflicts or whatever, they say, nope, take the next 15 minutes to do these warm-ups, right? And they already have a routine, hopefully. That's a standard that's set by that coach, and it helps with essentially having these players conform to it, right? And set that expectation of, hey, this is something that is mandatory for you to be able to perform and train with us. So I think that's the biggest thing is really having those non-negotiables of, you need to prioritize the health, right? And really emphasize that, the importance of that. If you're not warming up properly, you're not playing with us. So I think that sends a strong message to players and also to parents.
Do you foresee any challenges? Because we have different levels of coaches and players and so on, from rec to like professionals, right? Do you foresee any challenges implementing these kind of routines?
Yeah, I think it can certainly be tough to I'm going to go back to what I just mentioned about the standards set by the coach. So if a player chooses not to follow those standards, then they may be looking at less playing time in the future. And I think a coach has to stand firm on those things, right? And so that's sometimes tough. If your best player, right, you want to play them as a coach, but they're not following the standards that you're setting, well, you might have to make that tough decision of benching the player. So, then of course there may be some complaints from the parents who maybe don't have the full picture of what's going on, right? Because they're only hearing it from their kid. And so it's, in my opinion, it's really important to communicate early if bad habits are starting to pop up with the young players, so that those can be addressed not only by the coach, but also supported by the parents.
A fantastic point. Education, right? So it's all about educating, like not only your players, but also like the parents and the fans and audience. Like, if you're trying to get your kid into a sport, there has to be a routine, and a healthy routine, not just jump into the field. And when you're younger, you can do this, right? But the older you get, you're gonna feel the consequences of those routines. And people don't believe this. Like, we did the same thing back in the day. We just want to play. But like, thankfully, we had athletic trainers, physical therapists, and all that, like to guide us and nurture us and made sure that we follow those routines, and to set us for the right stage of performance, right? What's a good education for parents? Like, I know coach is going to communicate his expectations, and so like in my line of work, like if you don't warm up, you don't play. It's that simple. I cannot put you on you cannot perform if you're not warmed up or stretched out. I'm not going to risk any injuries, right?
Right.
But there's other coaches that do different things. Like, what's the best way to educate everybody, parents?
What's the best way to educate? That's
like email. You can send an email. You can send out like a training plans. You can send some videos, stretching. There's different ways of getting your point across. Maybe even get some guidance on, hey, this is the warm up routine. This is the stretches, like homework. Like sometimes I give homework to soccer players. Hey, you have to stretch. You have to watch soccer games. You have to, raise your soccer IQ, right? So there's different ways to educate the audience, or like whoever you cater to.
yeah. Well, I have a slightly different approach. Sometimes in my line of work, right, I see a lot of kids after something is hurting, right? And so I have opportunities to educate these individual athletes about what's going on with their body, because hey, this is hurting because of X, Y, and Z, right? And so I definitely take that approach with everyone I work with, not only with the youth athletes, but with the first team as well, because when there's an injury, right, you have to take the time to help these players understand what's going on with their bodies. And when they're equipped with the knowledge about their bodies and their injuries, they respond better to what I advise, right? Because it makes sense in their mind. Like, okay, well, if it's hurting because of X, Y, and Z, this is, and Mitch is telling me this is what I need to address. They buy in a little bit better, I think. So, and they also can feel that they're a little bit more involved in the decision-making process about their own bodies, rather than me just telling them, hey, you need to do this, this, and this, right? So they're a little bit more involved. They understand. They can, ask questions if they feel like we're not aligned, right? And so, so I think in terms of education, particularly with what I do with dealing with players that are injured, or players that are healthy and don't want to become injured, and that's really what it comes down to, is trying to teach them more about their body and how they respond to different stimuli. And for me, it's sometimes easier when a kid gets injured, honestly, to have those conversations. But hopefully with coaches that have those touch points a little bit more regularly, they can have maybe talk about your own experiences, right? Like, hey, I didn't do this, so I've experienced this in the past. And those types of stories sometimes will, kind of teach a kid, like, oh yeah, this is something that I don't want to happen to me, so I'm gonna take care of that. So so yeah, I again take a different approach, because I see kids in a different place. Obviously, I see them when they're healthy as well, but I don't necessarily have the touch points that coaches do at that point. So I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but
no, you did. It's because there's, everybody's got their own view. Like your view is a different view than my view as a coach or somebody else's. Everybody's got opinions, right? And like it's what's best for the kids. Like in your opinion, like what like when you see like these young athletes, what's the most common injury that you've seen? Like what I'm noticing a lot, like it's growth spurt, like like they go through these big changes and it's affecting their bodies. And sometimes they don't know how to handle it. Like, what's your advice in that area? Like,
yeah, that's a really tough one, because the body goes through so much change during puberty, right? And so you see kids that have a massive growth spurt, and they're just not adapting well to their bodies, right? And so they have muscle pain because they've grown 6 inches. That's a tough one, because there's not much that we can do to help in those situations, unfortunately, right? But that might just be a matter of load management. And so just doing what you can, but not going to the point where you're hurting a lot the next day, right? And so that often requires a lot of guidance from coaches and parents and other support people, because the player just wants to play, right? And they don't know any better. But then they play to the point of pain. It's not healthy for them, or it's not helping their performance. it might stunt their development as a person and a player. It's hard, and so that is a difficult place to navigate.
It's a tough,
yeah, it's a tough one,
right?
For sure. It's a tough one because I think a lot of people will say, I just played through it, it's normal, and yeah, it is normal, but that's the growth spurt thing is a tough one, because if you look at it from is it an injury or not? It's not an injury. Sometimes there's just pain without any structures that are damaged. So that's a tough one, and a lot of that comes down to load management, like I said, just doing what you can without harming yourself. And the other thing would be stretching, like we talked about. I think that's very important, because your muscles have to adapt to the length of the bones, right? And so if your bones are growing but your muscles are just not catching up, that's usually when growth pains happen. And then it comes back to the other stuff too, is nutrition, right? They need the proper nutrition to help with the growth, right? Help with muscle development, things of that nature. And I would say the other thing would be working on those. I touched on it before, but the foundational fitness muscles. And so you talk about your core and your glutes and balance exercises, because those are the things that really get thrown off through the growth process. And so really focus on on those areas will help mitigate a lot of those growth pains, in my opinion, just because those muscles tend to offset a lot of the areas that are the hot spots for pain when it comes to growth pain. And so oftentimes you have knee pain in the front of your knee because of Osgood-Schlatter's or things of that nature. That's a popular, well, I don't want to say popular, but a common one, in your heel, right? And oftentimes those come from the fact that your quad muscles are just not catching up to the length of your thigh bone, right? And so there's tension through the muscle, which then puts stress on the attachment points, of the tendons to the bone. And then in your heel as well, your calf muscles, again, not catching up to the length of the shin bones growing, and so they take a lot of stress right at that attachment point. And so stretching obviously becomes a key component in that, so that they can help the muscles just kind of lengthen out and catch up to those. But going back to what I said about the core and the glute muscles, they actually counteract a lot of those actions, and so they help actually lengthen out those areas. So the quads and the hamstrings are in opposite correlation with each other, and so if the quad muscles are shortened, hamstrings are longer, right? And so if you can shorten up the hamstring areas by pulling the pelvis back, it's probably getting a little bit more complex than you want, but by working on the glute and the core muscles, it actually helps neutralize the pelvis, and so the muscle imbalances become less. So that, I think, is an important area to focus on if you're having those growth pains.
Oh, no, that's fantastic. And that's kind of where I was heading with the question, because if you do a proper warm-up, dynamic stretching, have the performance cool down, hydrate yourself, that's going to mitigate, like the risk of getting injured. It's going to help you with the healing and everything else. So no matter like if it's growth spurt or if it's like a pain in the muscle, if you do the right things by warming up, like stretching, like even after you finish, the static stretching, even after practice, keep stretching at home stretching, it's just going to help you long-term prevent those risks. And that's, I think we just covered it, everything that can happen to you because of not, stretching properly or like focusing on the core muscles that you have to focus on. Any advice from your side to coaches, parents, players to continue, like, with the routine, like anything else you want to leave them with?
I would say consistency breeds success is what I would say. There have been many studies that have scientifically proved that appropriate warm-up programs can effectively reduce injury risk. But the caveat to that is that they must be adhered to. So in my opinion, youth coaches absolutely must have a meeting with the parents at the start of the season to go over the team's standards and expectations and get them on board with what you're trying to do as coaches. And then, and hopefully your philosophies can then be carried on at home, and really supported and enforced by the parents. So really having the parents on board with, really being a part of that whole youth development, I think is really important. The onus shouldn't just fall on the coaches, because it just shouldn't. Like like I said, the other 22, what you're doing at home is just as important, if not more important, than what you're doing on the field. So, building routines to have consistency in your day-to-day life, hopefully then will lead to consistency in your performance, which then, coaches love to see that, right? Is if you have a reliable player that's consistently putting in, a 7 or 8 performance, those players are the ones that are their coaches love that, right? Versus a player that is a little bit inconsistent. They might be a 10 one day, but next day they might be a 2 or a 3, and those are not the types of players that the coaches can feel like they can count on. So I think consistency in your daily life, it hopefully can lead to consistency in your performance as a player.
Excellent. Well, Mitch, thank you very much for being part of the podcast. I appreciate your time, and thank you again. We'll see you probably on TV with the MLS Orlando City team on the sidelines. Is that correct?
Yeah. I try to stay away from that as much as possible, but because whenever you see me or our staff on the field, that's never a good sign. So,
well, you did to help them out, right? That's in a good sense, for the good cause.
yes, but we hate seeing injured players, so that's we try to stay up to the sideline as much as possible.
Excellent. Thanks again, Mitch. Thank you for being part of it.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here. So thanks for having me, Alden.